It was a grey winter morning when Richard Harrison, a successful entrepreneur at 55, decided to arrive early at his corporate headquarters. For decades, he had commanded one of the largest real estate development firms in the country, accustomed to managing millions, closing billion-dollar deals, and maintaining an impeccable routine where every minute was worth gold. That morning, however, something interrupted his usual precision. As he walked down the corridor leading to his office, he heard an almost imperceptible sound coming from the small employee break room. It was too early for any staff member to be there. Curious and slightly irritated by the breach of protocol, he approached quietly. What he saw paralyzed him completely. Sitting on the floor, leaning against the cold wall, was Margaret, the cleaning woman who had been maintaining his office for 3 years. She was 50 years old, with graying hair pulled back in a simple bun, wearing her faded blue uniform. In her trembling hands, a plastic container held cold rice and a few pieces of sausage that Richard immediately recognized. They were leftovers from the company's holiday party held 2 days earlier. Margaret ate slowly, chewing each forkful as if it were her last. Her eyes fixed on the floor, her posture curved like someone carrying the weight of 1,000 silent humiliations. She wasn't even using the break room table. She was literally hiding, as if she didn't deserve to occupy that space. Richard felt something strange tighten in his chest. He stepped back before she noticed him, but the image remained etched in his mind like a painful photograph. Throughout the entire morning meeting, while discussing investments and market strategies, he couldn't stop thinking about that woman eating on the floor. That night, alone in his luxury penthouse, Richard opened a bottle of expensive wine, but the taste seemed bitter to him. He looked around. Artwork on the walls, imported furniture, a privileged view of the illuminated city. Everything perfect, everything empty. When was the last time he had really looked at the people who worked around him? When did he stop seeing human beings and start seeing only functions? In the following days, he began to observe Margaret discreetly. He discovered that she always arrived at 5 in the morning, an hour before the official schedule, to ensure everything was impeccable when the executives arrived. He noticed that she never had lunch in the cafeteria with the other employees, always bringing a tiny lunchbox that she ate quickly, alone, in some hidden corner. Intrigued, Richard asked the Human Resources Department for Margaret's file. What he read left him deeply disturbed. Margaret had a basic salary, the minimum allowed by law. She had worked for 3 years without any raise, without complaints, without absences. Widowed for 8 years, she was raising 2 teenage grandchildren alone after her daughter had died in an accident. She lived in a distant community, taking 2 hours of public transportation to get to work. The information was dry, bureaucratic, but behind those numbers, Richard began to see a story of struggle, sacrifice, and silent dignity. Margaret didn't ask for anything because she had learned that people like her had no right to ask. They just accepted, thanked, and remained invisible. That night, Richard couldn't sleep. He searched through his memories, trying to understand when he had become so distant. He remembered his own humble childhood, the son of a factory worker and a seamstress, growing up in a simple neighborhood where food on the table was a daily achievement. He recalled his mother, who at 50 years old had calloused hands from so much work, but always a tired smile on her face. How had he forgotten all of this? His mother, Elena, had worked as a housekeeper for wealthy families throughout her life. Richard remembered waiting for her at the bus stop as a child, watching her descend the steps with shoulders slumped from exhaustion, her hands red and rough from cleaning chemicals. She never complained, never asked for help, never demanded what she deserved. She simply worked, silently, invisibly, much like Margaret. Richard remembered one particular winter when he was 12 years old. His mother had come home late, her eyes red from crying. When he asked what was wrong, she had simply hugged him and said, Nothing, my love. Mama's just tired. Years later, he discovered that her employer had fired her without notice, without severance pay, simply because they were cutting costs. His mother had found another job within days, never allowing her pride to show the devastation she felt. That memory haunted Richard now. How many Margarets had his mother worked alongside? How many women had suffered in silence, invisible to the world, their struggles dismissed as simply part of life's natural order? Success, Richard realized, had built walls around him, walls of indifference, of detachment, of false superiority. He had everything, but had lost something essential, the ability to see the other person. He had become exactly the type of employer he had resented as a child, the type who saw workers as expendable resources rather than human beings with dreams, fears, and families. The next morning, Richard made a decision. He called an urgent meeting with all the managers and directors of the company. The announcement was direct and surprising. Starting that week, all employees, without exception, would receive a salary increase based on fair criteria of length of service and performance. In addition, an educational assistance program would be implemented for children and dependents of employees, along with expanded medical assistance. The room fell silent. Some directors began to question the costs, the feasibility, the impact on profits. Thomas Brennan, the chief financial officer, stood up, his face flushed with frustration. "Richard, with all due respect, this is financial suicide. We're talking about millions of dollars annually. Our shareholders will revolt. The board will never approve this." Richard looked at him calmly. "Thomas, what's our current annual profit?" "Approximately $320 million, Thomas replied cautiously. "And how much will this program cost?" "Roughly $15 million annually. So we're talking about less than 5% of our profits," Richard said, his voice firm but not harsh. 5% to ensure that the people who make this company function can live with dignity. 5% so that no one in this building has to choose between feeding their family and paying for medicine. 5% so that no one has to eat leftovers on the floor, hiding like they've committed a crime. The room remained silent. Richard continued, his voice gaining strength. "I've spent 30 years building this company. I've sacrificed time with family, health, relationships, all in pursuit of profit. And you know what? I was wrong. Not about building the company, but about forgetting why we build anything in the first place. We build to create value, not just for shareholders, but for everyone whose lives we touch." He paused, looking at each face around the table. "Profit without humanity isn't success. It's just accumulation. Make it happen. And if any of you can't support this, I'll accept your resignation with understanding. But this is the direction we're going." But there was more. Richard asked them to call Margaret to his office. When she entered, pale and visibly nervous, thinking she would be fired for some failure she was unaware of, he asked her to sit down. Margaret hesitated, having never sat in that expensive leather chair in front of the imposing desk. "Margaret," Richard began, his voice softer than usual, "how long have you been working here?" 3 years, Mr. Harrison," she answered quietly, her hands clasped in her lap. "And in that time, has anyone ever asked you if everything is okay? If you need anything?" Margaret blinked, confused. No one had ever asked those questions. "No, sir. But everything is fine, don't worry." Richard sighed. "Margaret, I saw you the other day eating party leftovers on the break room floor, and that's not fine." Margaret's face turned red with shame. She began to apologize, the words tumbling out, her eyes welling up. "I'm sorry, sir. I didn't mean to waste food. I know I shouldn't have. The food was going to be thrown away, and I thought... I'm so sorry. Please don't fire me. I need this job. My grandchildren depend on me. I'll never do it again, I promise." "You didn't understand," Richard interrupted gently. "Richard, it's not fine, because no human being should have to hide to eat. because you work with dignity and deserve to be treated with dignity. Margaret, tell me about your grandchildren." The question caught her off guard. My grandchildren? Yes, what are their names? How old are they?" Margaret's eyes widened with surprise. In 3 years, no one in management had ever asked about her personal life. "David is 15 and Emma is 13. They're good kids, sir. David wants to be an engineer and Emma loves to draw. They're so smart, both of them, but—" Her voice trailed off. "But what?" Richard prompted gently. "But I can't afford to send them to a good school. They go to the public school near our home, and it's not the best. The teachers are overworked, the facilities are falling apart, and I worry every day about their future. I worry that they'll end up like me, working hard, but never getting ahead." Richard felt a lump in his throat. "Is that why you were eating the leftovers? To save money for them?" Margaret nodded, tears now flowing freely. "I send most of my salary to cover their expenses: food, clothes, school supplies, transportation. There's a small after-school program I pay for, so they're not alone while I'm at work. After I pay for everything they need, there's barely anything left for me, but that's okay. They're my priority. They're all I have left of my daughter." She pulled out a worn photograph from her pocket, showing it to Richard with trembling hands. "This is Sarah, my daughter. She was a nurse. She died 5 years ago in a car accident on her way home from a night shift at the hospital. She was saving lives until the very end." Richard took the photograph, studying the smiling young woman who looked so much like Margaret. "I'm so sorry for your loss." "She was a single mother," Margaret continued, her voice breaking. "The children's father left when Emma was a baby. Sarah worked so hard to give them a good life, and then she was just gone. I had to step in. I had to be strong for them. But some days, Mr. Harrison, I'm so tired of pretending everything is okay when I'm barely holding on." Richard opened a drawer and pulled out an envelope. Inside, Margaret found a new employment contract with triple the salary, a generous food allowance, complete health insurance, and full scholarships for her 2 grandchildren at one of the best private schools in the city. Additionally, a substantial check as a bonus for years of exemplary service. Margaret held the papers with trembling hands, unable to speak. She read them once, then again, as if unable to believe what she was seeing. "Why, sir," she managed to whisper, "why are you doing this?" Richard felt his own eyes burn. "Because my mother was your age when she died, Margaret. She worked her entire life without anyone recognizing her value. She cleaned houses for people who never learned her name, who never asked about her life, who never saw her as anything more than someone who scrubbed their floors and washed their dishes. I can't change her past, but I can change your present. And because, honestly, you taught me something I had forgotten, that wealth without compassion is worth nothing." He leaned forward, his voice earnest. "Margaret, you've worked here for 3 years, and I'm ashamed to say I never really saw you until that morning. You were just part of the background, part of the machinery that kept things running. But you're not machinery. You're a woman who has sacrificed everything for her family, who works with integrity and dedication, who deserves so much more than what this world has given you." Margaret broke down completely, sobbing into her hands. Richard came around the desk and knelt beside her chair, something he had never done for anyone in his professional life. "It's okay," he said softly. "Let it out. You've been strong for so long. You're allowed to cry." When Margaret finally composed herself, she looked at Richard with red, puffy eyes. "I don't know how to thank you. You've changed our lives. My grandchildren will have opportunities I could never give them. They won't have to struggle like I did, like Sarah did. They can actually dream now." "You don't need to thank me," Richard said. "Just promise me something. Promise me that you'll never hide to eat again. Promise me that you'll hold your head high and remember that you are valuable, not because of what you do, but because of who you are." In the following months, the transformation was remarkable. Margaret not only continued working, She wanted to continue, despite Richard having offered her a comfortable retirement, but now did so with her head held high, having lunch in the cafeteria with colleagues, participating in the company's social activities. Her grandchildren, previously with an uncertain future, now studied with renewed hope. David thrived at his new school, excelling in mathematics and physics. His teachers praised his curiosity and dedication. Emma discovered a talent for art that bloomed under proper instruction, her drawings becoming more confident and expressive. Both children spoke frequently about their grandmother with pride and love, no longer worried about her sacrificing herself for their sake. Richard, in turn, began a profound personal transformation. He implemented a program in the company called Dignity First, where every employee was treated with genuine respect, regardless of position. He began having lunch regularly in the cafeteria with employees, listening to stories, learning about realities, reconnecting with the humanity he had lost. He discovered stories that broke his heart and inspired him. There was James, a security guard who was studying law online at night, dreaming of becoming a public defender to help people who couldn't afford legal representation. There was Sophia, a receptionist who was caring for her elderly mother with Alzheimer's while working full-time. There was Marcus, a janitor who volunteered at a homeless shelter every weekend, despite his own financial struggles. Each person had a story, a dream, a struggle, and Richard had been blind to all of it. He also began working with charitable institutions, especially those supporting middle-aged women in vulnerable situations, knowing there were thousands of invisible Margarets throughout the city. He invested in professional training programs, food assistance, and psychological support. He established a foundation in his mother's name, dedicated to helping working-class families access education, healthcare, and opportunities. The foundation's first project was a community center in the neighborhood where Richard had grown up. It offered after-school programs for children, job training for adults, and support services for families in crisis. Richard attended the opening ceremony, standing in the same streets where he had played as a child, now transformed into a hub of hope and possibility. One day, 6 months after that initial encounter, Richard and Margaret were in the company cafeteria during a collective lunch. She had helped organize the event, now also working in the Human Resources Department, helping to identify employees who needed support. Her role had evolved naturally. People trusted her, opened up to her, knowing she understood their struggles firsthand. You know, Margaret," said Richard, observing the hall full of people talking animatedly, "that morning when I saw you on the break room floor, I thought I was having a bad day. But actually it was the best day of my life." Margaret smiled, that smile that now frequently illuminated her face. "And you know what's funny, Mr. Richard? I thought that would be my worst day, the day I would finally be discovered and fired. But it was the day I was reborn." Richard then perceived the profound truth of that exchange. He hadn't saved Margaret, they had saved each other. She reminded him of his lost humanity, and he returned to her the dignity stolen by years of silent injustice. That evening, Margaret invited Richard to her home for dinner. It was a small, modest apartment in a working-class neighborhood, but it was clean and filled with warmth. David and Emma were there, nervous about meeting the man who had changed their lives. Over a simple meal of pasta and salad, Richard listened as the children talked about their school, their dreams, their plans for the future. David wanted to design sustainable buildings that would provide affordable housing for low-income families. Emma wanted to use her art to tell stories of overlooked people, to make the invisible visible. "Where did you learn such empathy?" Richard asked them. David and Emma exchanged glances, then looked at their grandmother. "From Grandma," Emma said simply. "She taught us that everyone has value, that everyone deserves respect. Even when we had nothing, she always shared what little we had with others, who had even less." Margaret blushed. "I just taught them what my Sarah taught me and what her grandmother taught her. Kindness doesn't cost money. It costs attention and care and the willingness to see other people as they really are." That night, returning home, Richard stopped in front of his mother's portrait that he kept on the shelf. "Forgive me for taking so long," he whispered, "but I finally understood what you tried to teach me. That the true value of a person isn't in what they possess, but in what they're capable of doing for others." The story of Richard and Margaret spread discreetly through the business community. Some called him crazy for wasting money on employees. Others mocked his sudden attack of conscience, dismissing it as a midlife crisis or a publicity stunt. But many others began to question their own practices, their own values. Richard gave a speech at a business conference 6 months later, standing before hundreds of executives and entrepreneurs. He told Margaret's story with her permission, leaving out identifying details, but conveying the emotional truth of what had happened. "I want you to imagine something," he said to the silent audience. "Imagine that every person in your organization is someone's mother, someone's father, someone's child. Imagine that the decisions you make about their wages, their benefits, their working conditions directly impact whether a child gets to go to college, whether a sick parent gets proper medical care, whether a family stays together or falls apart under financial stress." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Now imagine that you have the power to change those outcomes, not through charity, not through pity, but through simple fairness and recognition of human dignity. What would you choose?" The speech went viral online, sparking debates in business schools, corporate boardrooms, and living rooms across the country. Some praised Richard's approach as enlightened leadership. Others criticized it as naive idealism that ignored economic realities. But the conversation had begun, and it wouldn't be easily silenced. And while the city continued its frenetic routine, inside Richard's company, a small, silent revolution was happening. A revolution where seeing the other person, really seeing them, had become more important than any profit spreadsheet. Employee turnover dropped dramatically, productivity increased, customer satisfaction improved. It turned out that when people felt valued and respected, they brought their best selves to work. Who would have thought? But the numbers weren't what mattered most to Richard anymore. What mattered were the moments, seeing Margaret laugh freely with colleagues in the cafeteria, receiving graduation photos from David and Emma, hearing stories from employees about how the new policies had changed their lives. 1 year after that fateful morning, Richard organized a company anniversary celebration. Unlike previous years' formal affairs, this was a casual gathering with families invited. Children ran through the halls, laughter echoed off the walls, and the atmosphere was one of genuine community rather than corporate obligation. Margaret stood with Richard, watching the scene unfold. "You've built something special here," she said. "Not just a company, but a family." Richard shook his head. "We built it together, Margaret. You showed me what was possible when we treat people with the dignity they deserve. All I did was have the resources to make it happen, the vision, the heart of it, that came from you." "Then we make a good team," Margaret said with a smile. As the evening progressed, Richard found himself surrounded by employees wanting to share their stories, to thank him, to tell him how the changes had impacted their lives. He listened to each one, really listened, storing their words in his heart. A young woman named Jennifer approached him shyly. "Mr. Harrison, I wanted you to know that the Education Benefit Program allowed me to finish my degree. I graduated last month with honors. And because of that, I was able to get promoted to a position where I can use my skills to help the company grow. You invested in me when no one else would." An older man named Robert clasped Richard's hand firmly. "My wife was diagnosed with cancer last year. Without the expanded health insurance, we would have lost our home trying to pay for treatment. But because of your changes, She got the care she needed. She's in remission now. You saved her life, Mr. Harrison. You saved our family. Story after story, life after life, changed by a simple decision to value human beings over profit margins. Because in the end, Richard learned that true wealth isn't measured in numbers in a bank account, but in the genuine smiles of people who recovered their dignity, in the renewed hope of those who thought the world had forgotten their existence. And it all began with a 50-year-old woman eating alone on the floor, invisible to everyone, except for one man who finally decided to open his eyes and see what really mattered in life. That single moment of awareness transformed not just two lives, but created ripples of change that would touch countless others, proving that compassion, when acted upon, becomes the most powerful force for transformation in our world. Years later, when Richard was asked about the secret to his company's success, he would always tell the same story, the story of Margaret and the morning that changed everything. He would end by saying, "Success isn't about how much you accumulate. It's about how many lives you touch, how much dignity you restore, how much hope you create. That's the only metric that truly matters." And somewhere in that same city, Margaret would be helping another struggling employee navigate a difficult time, sharing her story, offering hope, and proving every day that kindness, once received, multiplies infinitely when passed along to others.